All right. Well, thank you, Joey, for joining us. Joey's going to be presenting on spatial analysis for the 2025 Tennessee State Wildlife Action Plan. We'd love to hear about everything you do at your organization, what GIS is all about there, and tell us a little more about the Tennessee State Wildlife Action Plan. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here. It's also good to see a lot of you in person. I use a lot of your data all the time, and so yeah, it's great to have the opportunity to kind of share some of the stuff that we've been doing with all of your great work. So I'm Joey Wisby. I'm the GIS manager for the Tennessee chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And first of all, can everybody see my screen? Did I share?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. Yeah, and I've been with the Tennessee chapter. I've been with the Conservancy for almost 30 years. Going back, I spent 6 years in Florida when I started my career at the Disney Preserve down there, and then have been in Tennessee since 2001. I've also been, I'm going to be talking today, obviously, about the State Wildlife Action Plan and kind of the GIS work that we do for that particular planning process. My history with the State Wildlife Action Plan goes back to the first one, which was done in 2005, or we turned it in 2005. And TWRA is the agency that is responsible for producing the plan. And so they have, since the first one was required in 2005, been contracting with the Nature Conservancy to help partner with them in producing the plan. And so I've been involved in that process, starting with the first plan. And then it's required to be updated every 10 years. And so I participated in the 10-year update that was due in 2015, and I'm now on my third rodeo doing the 2025 plan. And I don't have a lot of foundational slides, and so I'm just going to kind of explain the basic process, or one of the key products that we do as foundation for the plan is habitat prioritizations for terrestrial. So we do a terrestrial habitat prioritization, an aquatic habitat prioritization, and a karst habitat prioritization. The State Wildlife Action Plan has a bunch of different elements that are required, and it's Fish and Wildlife Service that sets the requirements. And so one of kind of the basic requirement is we have to have a list of species. These species targets are what we are trying to conserve. And the whole basic idea behind the whole thing is to try to keep rare, but not so rare that they need to be federally listed species, common enough that they don't need to be federally listed. So it's a proactive way to manage species that are somewhat rare, but not so rare and imperiled that they need to be federally listed. And so we also include federally listed species as targets and are included in the prioritization, but that's kind of the basic idea. So we're starting with species targets, and then we also have to map their habitat. And so what we do is not only map the habitat, but then prioritize the habitat based on this modeling approach that I'm going to walk through, that helps identify where you have places on the ground that are providing the most habitat, the best habitat for the most of the rarest species, and what we think is still out there on the ground to be using that habitat. So terrestrially, we start with the terrestrial species, and all the species are divvied up into, we have terrestrial, aquatic, and karst species. We also have some species like bats that straddle, that are both terrestrial and karst targets. But the basic idea is to, start with the terrestrial species, and then we use a very evidence-based approach. And so it's all based on occurrences that we gather and compile, starting obviously with the heritage data set that you all produce and maintain, but then add on to that other data sets that we know are out there. eBird is a big one. TWRA has their own, a bunch of data sets that they maintain that may or may not find their way into heritage data. And so we compile all of that occurrence information, and then everything is prioritized based on that. So there's a lot of spatial analysis that puts those occurrences together and identifies the habitat that they could potentially be using. And then terrestrially, we also obviously are having to map habitats. And what we have always used is the GAP ecological system data set. And so that is the mapped occurrences of these habitats within the state of Tennessee. And then we go through a process terrestrially. We link the species to their habitats. We have a big database that was started back in the 2005 planning process. And folks at Heritage, the plant people at Heritage, have since added plants. And then every time we do a revision and we have new species that are new targets, we have to then go in and assign habitat preferences between the species and those ecological systems. So we say for this species, what of these ecological systems are preferred, suitable, marginal, or unsuitable habitat for that particular species. All of that goes into a big database that then we use to help link up species and their occurrences to habitats that are on the ground. I should step back and say that a lot of the work that I do has two components. It has a GIS component and a relational database component. And all of this swap stuff, a lot of the actual data and a lot of the actual analysis takes place in the relational database environment. And then I use the spatial environment to make those spatial linkages and then also to map, results, obviously, and things like that. So, and I've used Microsoft Access pretty much my entire career. And so that's what I continue to use, even though it creates a lot of problems and there's a lot of workarounds I have to do because of the file size limitations and things like that. But that's kind of the way that I've always done things. So we start with the occurrences for these species and then mapping those habitats. And like I said, we've always used the GAP habitats classification. This time around, I started messing with, I really wanted to use the wetland mapping that TDEC and SkyTech, you guys collaborated on to produce. And so I started down this process when that became available of evaluating how we'd use it. And the first thing that we would need to do to be able to use it is to find out what ecological system or assign those wetland occurrences or those wetland blobs on the ground to their appropriate ecological system. So in doing that, we have a proprietary data set that the Nature Conservancy has permission to use that is called Fathom, and it maps flood frequency out on the landscape and does an amazing job of that. And so this is a data set that people across the Conservancy use on a regular basis. It's very foundational to our work. And I had been using it in the aquatic habitat prioritization that I'm going to show you here in a minute. And so I started looking at that and thinking that, all right, maybe we could use this to help understand what those SkyTech / TDEC wetlands are, whether they're isolated, whether they're connected to the stream network, and how we might classify those into ecological systems. In doing that, I realized that, the Fathom data is actually a more robust, complete mapping of at least potential wetlands out there on the landscape. And so I actually have put pause on the SkyTech wetlands and have gone to this Fathom-based approach for mapping wetlands. And it's been very exciting, and it's worked out really well, and have also another big kind of step up that we've had is the new cropland data layer that just got released is now 10-meter resolution. So we're finally able to get from the 30-meter resolution that every land use land cover has ever been into this 10-meter resolution data set. And so I've gone through a process of kind of mashing up what was in our GAP landfire ecological system data set, the existing one that we've been using, these new Fathom-based wetlands, and the new cropland data layer to help understand where semi-natural and non-natural features are on the landscape in a much more detailed way. So this is the wetland and riparian ecological systems that are expected to occur in Tennessee. And this is just to kind of show what this new mapping has gotten us in terms of identifying and putting on the ground where these various wetlands are. And so you can see this column here is what we had in the existing GAP 2011 in terms of mapped acres of each of these systems, and then what we were able to augment using the Fathom data, and what we currently have now, and what the net difference is. And so you can see there's almost 1.7 million new acres of South Central interior small stream and riparian habitat that have been identified, 400,000 acres of East Coastal Plain forest, that kind of thing. So you can see it's been a big step up and increase in our understanding of where these wetlands are out on the landscape. So we've also been in the process of updating the habitat preferences that I was talking about, and have completed that work. We also added 10 million eBird records, updated the occurrence data with the latest natural heritage data set. And then something that is, there's a history behind this, but I have done the work in Tennessee for the past 3 swap revisions, and then Kentucky was on a different schedule, and they had to have their update done in 2023. And so they actually contacted and worked with us to do the same modeling work that we've done in Tennessee for Kentucky. So the terrestrial and the aquatic models got expanded and included and were expanded to include Kentucky back in 2023. And this 2025 revision process that I've been going through for Tennessee, I've also been doing the same work for Kentucky, and kind of bringing all the revisions that I'm doing for the Kentucky model as well. All right, so this is what this all ends up looking like on the ground. And the basic process is that we take all the occurrences of all of the GCN target species, all of the species that are targets in the swap plan, and we map where they are on the ground using their occurrences. And then we build out these footprints using hexagons, and go, each hexagon gets a score for each species based on how close the occurrences are to that hexagon for each species, what the last obs date for that occurrence is. So what we're trying to get at is what still indicates extant populations on the ground. So where there are, these occurrences indicate a larger population, and we're trying to get at what we think could still be out there on the landscape at that location. So we use the last obs date, when it was last seen at that location, to kind of to estimate that. The footprints are sized based on how mobile that species is, and we use heritage has a suitability buffer distance that they use to help them indicate whether 2 occurrences are the same population or should be treated as separate populations. And so we use that same buffer distance as kind of to scale the size of the footprint we should put around that species occurrences. We also now are using, and I won't get into this, but if folks are familiar with the Uber H3 hexagons, which are hexagons that fit into each other at different scales. This is a new thing that I just got done doing yesterday that kind of divvies up the species based on how mobile they are and the size of the footprints we're putting around them. I'm using those different size hexagons, the H3 hexagons from Uber, and that allows us to do these footprints at different scales and do larger footprints than we've been able to do in the past without breaking the computer, basically. We then identify using those habitat preferences. So within each hexagon, we've got mapped habitats, and we say, all right, for the species that are around it, is that habitat that occurs there suitable, marginal, or preferred for that species? And then all of that gets put into a score. And so you have all of these overlapping footprints of all of these species. And for each habitat on the ground, when we look at all of those species and say, all right, how close is it? How relatively rare is that species? When was it last seen there? And what is the preference of that species for this habitat type? Add all of that together and you get a map that looks like this. And so the darker the red on this map, the higher the priority is for the most GCN species. Again, very heavily weighted toward what are the rarest of the rare, what is still out there on the landscape, what have the highest preference for that habitat type, all of that information. And so you kind of see there are certain patterns that show up at statewide scale, but then if I zoom in, you start to see a lot more detail and a lot of variation in the habitat priorities. And that's based on, you know, these various ecological systems. You have semi-natural habitat, you have natural, various, you know, wetland types, upland types, all of that is getting scored separately at the actual, you know, blob of habitat on the ground gets a different score. The effect of the new wetlands is hard to really see at this scale. You can kind of see it in some places where you have these riparian zones that are higher priority. But I've got an example here of a close-up that kind of shows, you know, this new wetland mapping. And the wetlands are obviously very high priority habitats on the landscape. And so we're seeing that now really for the first time that we have all of these wetlands mapped, seeing, you know, that higher priority mapped out in the final results. And so you can see in these riparian areas, those priority scores are higher than the upland areas that are around them typically, which is very exciting. And again, we've got this now for both Kentucky and Tennessee, and these are now, this is one seamless analysis, which I'm really excited about. I work a lot with the Kentucky chapter of the Conservancy, and they're using this information. We also work with partners up there. And so having all of this is, you know, across both states, it's pretty amazing how much habitat and species are shared across these states. And so having those priorities seamless is a really good thing. All right, so that's the terrestrial model. The aquatic model is a similar but slightly different process. This is kind of the final model results, and then I will zoom in and show two things that are going on this map. One is the actual stream network. You can see has different colors, and those colors are the actual priorities. So the aquatic habitats, the streams themselves are the aquatic habitats. And so the modeling process is identifying where you have those stream reaches that are the highest priority for our swap species targets. Again, it's a similar process where we start with the occurrences and then we snap them to the stream network. So we say, all right, this is the stream segment that occurrence was found at. We then go upstream and downstream. So the footprints are upstream and downstream from that known occurrence. And we say, all right, these other stream segments that are nearby could also be occupied by that species. And there's a habitat matching component so that we don't go off into some headwater, you know, small stream when it's a main stem species. So there's a habitat matching component as well to this. So we build out footprints that go upstream and downstream. And then, you know, again, as we look at how rare are each of these occurrences, when were they last seen there, what is the habitat preference, you know, based on the reference occurrence and how closely the other habitats upstream and downstream match that. All of that goes into the priority score. And so you get one score for each species and then add that up at each stream segment to get the overall priority for that stream segment based on all the species. The other thing that's going on this map is areas that are upstream of the high priority stream reaches are being lit up. And this is based on a hydrologic model that we developed and use that is built off the NHD Plus data set, if folks are familiar with that. And the NHD Plus starts with the stream segments and then has individual catchments that identify kind of the micro level watershed around each individual stream segment. And so it says, all right, if rainfall falls here, when it falls within this catchment, the water is going to flow downhill and end up in the stream somewhere along that particular stream segment. So it's this giant tessellation of individual stream segments and then the catchments that are around them. And there's this one-to-one relationship. Well, we've taken that and been able to build a hydrologic model that says, all right, when rainfall falls here into this catchment, here's the stream segments that it flows through downstream, how far away each of those are in terms of travel time of the water on a mean annual flow basis. What is the percent contribution of that catchment to the overall flow at each stream segment downstream? And so by running this hydrologic model, we're able to then, trace back upstream and go, okay, if these are the high priority stream segments, these are the catchments and the land area that matter most based on where the water is going to flow downstream. Where do you have the highest priority nearby downstream? All of that information is taken into account. There's also a lateral component that is based off of the Fathom data that identifies areas that are near the stream and gives them a higher priority than areas that are far away and in the upland. And so if I zoom in far enough, you can kind of see the effects of that, where the riparian areas are getting a higher priority than the upland areas based on that kind of lateral connectivity analysis that's part of this hydrologic model. So if I zoom out, you can see where this is the Duck River and the high priority land area. And you can see that not all the land is prioritized. And this map is kind of meant to show where the protection priorities are. So it's looking at what is natural habitat and what are the priorities of that natural habitat relative to the downstream aquatic habitat priorities. And so that's why, what's being lit up here is just the natural vegetation. So this is the Big South Fork. There's the Emery River. You've got the Conasauga down here that is very high priority, the Paint Rock River, the Powell and the Clinch River up in the northeast, the Hatchie River out west are all being lit up, based on being high priority habitats for GCN species. And again, we have this built for a larger area than Tennessee. We started in Tennessee, and then when we did the expansion to Kentucky, we included Kentucky. And the hydrologic model actually follows, the basins and hydrologic units more rather than, obviously the state lines. And so we've also expanded it just in the last year to include, and this is a Nature Conservancy project area, the Southern Appalachians. And so we expanded the aquatic habitat prioritization to include that area. And so this is kind of the current footprint that we have for where those priorities are. And again, this is based on gathering all the occurrences for this entire area and then going through that prioritization process. So, it's great to have this kind of context for this, even if we're working in Tennessee, to know how that is relative to other states and where we've got places that are important in Tennessee because the habitat that, straddles and crosses the state line down into, Alabama or Kentucky in the case of the Big South Fork, that kind of thing. We also have a karst habitat prioritization model that kind of is a hybrid of the terrestrial and aquatic approaches. So the karst model, the habitats themselves are the actual caves, the cave systems. And so we link the species and their occurrences to the cave that they were documented from, and then prioritize the caves based on, again, how rare are those species, their need for the cave environment. So are they troglobites or troglophiles? Can they live outside the cave, or are they utterly dependent on the cave environment? That gets put into a score. And so that allows us to then prioritize these caves across the landscape based on what are providing the most habitat for the rarest species that rely on that habitat the most. We then can prioritize the land area around these caves based on, we use two different buffers. So one is a smaller 2.5 kilometer buffer that says, all right, somewhere within here is where all the nutrient inputs to the cave are coming from. And anybody that's worked with caves knows that there's just a wild number of unknown variables until you do actual dye tracing and a lot of work at an individual cave system level. It's hard to understand the way that water flows, where it infiltrates into the ground, where it's coming from, where it comes out at the other end. All of that information is very unknown. And so we're trying to model what is potentially could be going on based on topography, proximity, and that kind of thing. So we have this one buffer that's says that, all right, the material contribution, all of the nutrients, the organic matter that's going to end up in the cave is going to come from somewhere within this smaller buffer. We then do a larger buffer that's kind of approximates, all right, if the water infiltration is probably starting from somewhere in this area on the surface. The new thing that we've done is then also used the hydrologic model to say, all right, if this is the potential hydrologic footprint around that particular cave, the water could also be flowing in on the surface streams and then getting to that recharge area and then infiltrating. And so we've incorporated that surface hydrologic flow into this current model. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. All right, so what this looks like when I zoom in now is each of these squares is a cave. And so you can see the larger the square and the darker the color, the higher the priority of that particular cave system. And then the land area is being prioritized based on understanding where lands are that are at or above that cave level. And we're looking at the cave elevation and then its documented depth. And then we subtract a little more for just a little cushion for error in there, and then say, all right, land that is below that minimum depth is probably not contributing to the organic matter, the nutrients, or the water that is maintaining and building these cave systems. And so we discount that land area, but then everything that is at or above that elevation is included. And again, we're now using the surface, the way that water flows at the surface to include in those prioritizations. And so you can see, places where we've got the actual stream reaches and their catchments being prioritized based on, all right, this is upstream of these cave systems downstream. And so it could be what's happening here could end up in those cave systems. And again, it's all potential because there's been relatively little dye tracing done, not enough to be able to map it at this statewide scale. All right, so I think I'm going to stop there. I had other examples of how we have combined the three models. I guess I'll just talk briefly about that. So we've also do a combined habitat prioritization that takes whatever the highest score is in the terrestrial, the aquatic, or karst at a given cell location, then gets used. So it's a way to identify where you've got, again, what is the highest priority in each of those individual models and be able to put that together to get an overall priority for our SWAP planning. This is all then foundational for a bunch of threats analysis that we do, looking at things like, in this example, we look at ag, and so we identify places where ag is occurring that could be potentially causing problems or a source of stress for downstream aquatic habitats. And there's a whole process that we use, again, using the hydrologic model to go to conduct that analysis. We also look at things like development pressure. So this is a new futures population growth analysis that we were able to then identify places where we've got high priority habitat and also high development pressure. Similarly with aquatics, we can identify where those development pressures are upstream of aquatic habitats, that kind of thing. So I will stop there and we'll get to questions. And I just briefly will say that where we are in this process is we are about ready to produce our draft plan and put out for public review. When that comes out, then I will be putting these draft layers up on ArcGIS Online so that they can be evaluated And it'll probably be, a web mapping tool, but also the ability to incorporate them, as tile layers in ArcGIS Pro. We'll then be finalizing. I still have some analyses I want to do, and so I'll be finalizing all of that, writing up, revising a white paper that we have for all of this methodology, probably doing some experience builder, story maps and other pages to kind of explain the process for all of this. And then the final plan is due at the end of September of this year. And so that's when everything will be published and turned into Fish and Wildlife Service. And then I'll be serving final layers up on ArcGIS Online. And we're also very supportive of, if people have custom products they want from this, what we find is that these layers are really foundational to a lot of other analyses that can be done with them. And so there's some of that analysis that I already know that I want to do, but we'll probably be also looking, at what other partners want to be able to do with the data as well. All right, so I'll stop there. I know that was a lot and I probably went really fast, but yeah, do we want to do questions, Andrew, or?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Thank you so much. This is awesome. Everybody, anybody else excited about seeing all this?
Most definitely. Awesome work, Joey.
Thank you. And I'm sorry it was really fast. It's a lot to try to get through in a half an hour. And I was really frustrated. I wanted, given that I don't get to do a technical audience presentation of this very often. And so I wish I had more time, or we could just focus on one component of it in more detail of how everything works. Because I have a feeling, you guys would understand it and would probably have a lot of good questions and ideas about ways to improve it. But yeah, so are there any questions about what I showed?
Yeah, go for it. And if you want, throw up one of the maps that looks so cool on our screen.
All right.
Just to get us all excited about it. David Lincecum had a question in the chat, and anybody else?
Hey, Joey, this is David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Hey, this is no critique in any way, but
No.
I know you've used a lot of different data sets. And so I'm just curious if you picked up on any bias in various data sets or cautions along the way, that kind of thing.
Yes. So there has always been, and it really shows up in the terrestrial, there is a lot of bias in where, frankly, where you have access to land to do sampling and find occurrences. And so there's always been a lot of bias towards protected lands. And that really shows up. It used to show up really, really heavily as just kind of these bullseyes around the protected land where there had been a lot of rare species sampling work done. So, and I mentioned that I just got done doing a new version that uses the Uber hexagons. And what that allowed us to do is, one of the reasons you ended up with those bullseyes is we were limited in how big the footprints we could do around the occurrences. And so we weren't really able to get to kind of a range-wide approximation of the potential populations around these species, just because we couldn't build footprints that big. It would lead to just so many records to try to model. But using those different scale Uber hexagons, I was able to go from 4 buffer distances to 10 buffer distances. So we more than doubled the footprint size that we were able to model. And that has really helped a lot in getting away from kind of this bullseye. You still see what seem to be bullseyes in this, but if you zoom in, it tends to be like, all right, it's one part of this. I think it's much more now indicative of what's really going on the ground. And so, you can see there are still bullseyes around. This is Fall Creek Falls and Centennial WMA. And so you can see there's a lot of hotspot around that, but there's also a lot of really hosed up habitat around that. So I think it is, it's not just sampling bias. And, these footprints now are getting way out beyond where these protected lands are. And so that's, I think, been a big help in getting around that bias. But you're right that there is, because we are going off of occurrences to build, it's foundational for these models. You're only going to get where they have occurred, where they have found those rare species. All right, other questions?
Yeah, Andrew, what was your question?
Oh, well, I was just thinking about, all these different data sources and the different topologies, and you've got what seem to be raster sources and vector sources and tabular sources. And, you probably obviously don't have time to go into it here. I'll look forward to seeing the methodology stuff that you end up being able to publish. But that's really the thing, I guess, that interested me the most, was how you were able to kind of wrangle all of these different types of sources of information and sort of pull that all together. Is the analysis then mostly raster based, or what types of statistical methods or would you say you're using most often to kind of help work through these problems?
Yeah, so it tends to be a mix of both vector and raster. So for example, the aquatic, obviously all the occurrences start as vector points. And then the aquatics, we've got the stream reaches themselves, our line vectors that are getting the priorities. And I also mentioned that I use access at the back end for a lot of this information. So typically what I will do is do the spatial analysis that I need to do. So for example, snap the aquatic occurrences to the stream network. And then the hydrologic model is built off of the vector data, but then I will rasterize the catchments so that then you can overlay that with things like land use land cover or whatever kind of threat you're trying to identify and analyze. So it just is a mix. And then a lot of it is just getting to the attribute tables in a way that you want them, and that so that then I can pull that into Access and build queries and put the different data sets together as I need to on that side. And so that's probably a really vague, unsatisfying answer, but that's, without getting into the relational database side, that's really how it all kind of works. And so I'm kind of agnostic about whether it's raster or vector data. And I actually end up using raster data kind of like vector data, where I'll have a raster layer that will have attribute columns associated with it, that then I will peel off in a lookup so that I can map it separately, but I can kind of treat them as vector layers in the GIS, which is helpful sometimes.
Thank you. No, that's exactly what I was getting at.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Dylan, you had a question too, right?
Hey, Joey, I had a couple. One was about like processing and running all of these analyses. Like, I assume you're not just running them on your desktop, and what that looks like. That's question one.
Okay, so yeah, the short answer is it all runs on my desktop. It all actually, I use a laptop, and it all runs on that. And if it can't run on that, I find a way to do it that does run on that. And yeah, so this isn't like, cloud big data analysis. It probably could be, and it could be a lot cooler if I did do that, but I just have never done it that way. And so, yeah, it all runs, typically stuff won't take longer than an hour to run. And that's probably infrequent for something to take that long to run. And usually it will crash before then. And if you do everything right, because I'm using the relational database, if you've got things indexed and you're good about the way that, you do straddle indexes that index separate columns that are going to be used together and summarized together, it all happens pretty quickly. And the computing power now, I find, is, you can do a lot with it. Yeah, so it's just on my desktop.
That's incredible. Whenever I do the export from biotics of that natural heritage data, my computer runs a couple hours just pulling that vector data out into like a geodatabase. So anyway, the other question was about you said you had the SkyTech product for the wetlands, and then you said like a proprietary access to Fathom. So I was curious about more about where Fathom comes from and what that is, and then also like more about how that's different from the SkyTech product and how you could look at that and say, oh, I think I'm going to go Fathom.
Yeah, so the Fathom data set, like I said, it's proprietary. It started out in the UK, the University of Bristol. They had a team that developed this assessment methodology, and then they spun it off into a company that is now, producing these Fathom products. And they're actually they do it globally, but the US data set is it's actually just based off of the 10-meter kind of pre-LiDAR raster DEMs. And I don't understand everything about it, but what they are able to do in a very consistent, seemingly very robust and very accurate way is identify flood frequency out there on the landscape. And so I pulled up the example map that I just clipped out to show. And so the darker the color on here, the higher the flood frequency. So areas that are open water are in black, and then the darkest blues are 5-year floodplains, 20-year flood frequency, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year. So those are kind of the basic frequencies that this data set maps. And it is relentlessly consistent over the landscape. Like every stream segment, and even some streams that aren't mapped, it will show how, all right, during times of heavy rain, that area is flooding, or it has surface water flow going through there. And so what we were after, a lot of these ecological systems they can be wetlands, or they can be floodplains that are kind of a mixture of wetland and upland, or wetland and riparian. And so the Fathom data really lent itself to, by using these different flood frequencies, we're able to tease out, all right, this is a mixed upland wetland system that is this ecological system. And then I had to use different widths to get at whether it was a large floodplain or small stream riparian, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was just the consistency of the mapping that really led me to focus on the Fathom data. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping to do between this draft and when we produce the final in September, is to go back to the SkyTech data and try to use it. I think that the isolated wetlands may show up really well in that SkyTech data. And so that may really supplement our mapping of the isolated wetlands in particular. And so I still am, the SkyTech data is amazing. I just could not figure out a way to make it work on a very consistent level for this initial mapping.
Great, that's great. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of love the Kentucky and Alabama inclusion in this. And I was just thinking we have like a Tennessee data set, I think. So it makes sense even more to use like something that's a broader region.
Yeah, definitely. And that was definitely a reason to, all right, let's try to solve with the Fathom, because we were trying to do the terrestrial model for Kentucky as well. And like you said, that SkyTech data set is very Tennessee only. So yeah, that's very true. Other questions or comments or?
Hey, Joey, did you also do karst habitat priorities in Kentucky? I know that a lot of the information that you were putting together for karst habitat priorities depended on, Tennessee cave survey data, as well as maybe biological observations that aren't part of more of the other authoritative data sets that we're typically used to. And I didn't know if the Kentucky Speleological Survey had contributed, or whether there was a relationship there yet.
No, we have not yet. And that was something that we kind of had to triage when we were doing the work for the Kentucky swap. They were interested in doing both wetlands and karst systems. And we just couldn't get to the karst system. Like you said, you know, because we're dependent on other data sets that I don't even like to talk about in a public setting. Yeah, we just weren't able to get a hold of that data for Kentucky the way that we have had access to those data sets in Tennessee. And so that's something that I would be very interested in doing if folks up there, you know, wanted a product like what we've done for Tennessee. I would love to expand it to include Kentucky, because it, you know, and as well as you know, Northwest Georgia and Northern Alabama are kind of the karst hotspot in this area, and Southwest Virginia as well. And so, yeah, any of those areas, if we could get a hold of the data, I'd be interested in doing that.
Awesome. Well, great work as always.
Thank you, Brian.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, go for it, Larry.
I have a question. I thought I'd mention when SkyTech stuff came out, I looked at looking up a relatively rare or a species that's semi-aquatic, semi-terrestrial in headwater seepages in places where maybe TDEC, for example, the regulations don't necessarily easily tease out whether that is a stream or not, and even wetlands would often be overlooked, and that system didn't show up in that data. So I am very excited to see more and improvements on this kind of stuff like Fathom.
Yeah, and the Fathom data, I should have probably explained that we have a license agreement where the Nature Conservancy, any of the Nature Conservancy staff can download and use the data in our work. And so we have this kind of a nonprofit relationship with them. What we are not allowed to do via that data sharing agreement is give out the data that would allow somebody to produce the original flood frequency information from that. But any derived products that we do, for example, if we use it to map these different ecological system wetland types, that data we're allowed to share. And so, yeah, I'm very happy and would be excited to share this information if it would be useful to other folks. And it will definitely be part of what gets released in draft form for the draft planning process. Probably in the next month or so, that'll be coming out. Other questions or thoughts?
Awesome. Do you guys have any public events where you'll be talking about this too and presenting, or you get together around in Tennessee to share this stuff?
Yeah, well, we have a steering committee, and that's actually most of this presentation that I showed you was what I put together for the State Wildlife Action Plan. Has a steering committee that probably some of the folks that were on this call were at that steering committee meeting. I'm not sure if we're going to do any public events. I'm hoping to get to some of the Tennessee GIS conference next spring and show some of this then. You know, if there are other places that we should be showing that, I would love to hear about them. But yeah, and we're trying to figure out whether we're going to have a fall steering committee meeting so that some of the final stuff may be presented there as well.
Awesome. That's so great. Well, thank you very much. Do you have some contact information you could put in the chat if anybody wants to reach out to you?
Yeah, my it's the best way to get a hold of me is email, and I'm just jwisby@tnc.org. So I will put that in the chat. And yeah, feel free to send me an email with requests or thoughts, or, you know, if you have other collaborations you want to do with the data, we're always open to